Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Philosophy of Technology Against the Machine. It was perfect. He could do nothing about it. Its waters were as clear as his own eye. The grass was his breath. The mystery of the dark earth was what went on in himself. He loved and hated it with a parent's conceit, admiring his own work, resenting its independence. There were trysts in the greenwood at which he was not welcome. Youths and girls fondling the pages of a strange book awakened his envy. The mind achieved what the heart could not. He began planning the destruction of the long peace of the place. The machine appeared in the distance, singing to itself of money. Its song was the web they were caught in, men and women together. The villages were as flies to be sucked empty. God secreted a tear. Enough, enough, he commanded, but the machine looked at him and went on singing. R.S. Thomas, Other. Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. Edward Abbey. Hi everybody, and this is what I'm looking at today. I was going to call it a book review, but it isn't really, because it's going to take maybe 3 videos in total to do this book justice. But it's only just recently come out. Unfortunately, it's only in hardback at the moment, or I won't even suggest this, but the filthy, filthy Kindle, if you're that way depraved, shame on you. But it's a great book, and I wanted to introduce some of its ideas to you. And I'll just list some of the reasons I think it's a great book. As you can see, he's using the phrase machine to describe what other theorists that he references in the book have called a number of things. But basically, the technics is one, for example, that Lewis Mumford refers to, is one of the theorists. And that's one of the aspects of the book I really like. He quotes and references quite a lot of theorists who I think are undervalued or almost semi-forgotten. And he revivifies them, brings them back to life a little bit. And in general, it's a really well-researched book. So when he's talking about technology, I witter on this channel about art and literature, but my actual academic specialism back in the day was the very specialist field of the philosophy and sociology of technology. So a lot of the stuff, the ground he covers, I actually was the first couple of years of my PhD, and I can vouch for the fact that from a completely academic, professional point of view, Paul Kingsnorth does a really good job. So there's the quality of the substance of the book that I admire. And then he writes, he's been a long-time journalist, and I think he's had awards for at least one novel that he wrote. And you can tell his book benefits from the fact he's a very good writer. It makes some of the concepts sing. And there's a warmth to it that I liked, in the sense that he references authors that are vaguely controversial. So off the top of my head, Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West, which people get can be a bit antsy about in these, hypersensitive times we live in. But he's very fair, and he offers ways of reading Spengler that I found very useful. He just basically suggests you should read him as a poet rather than a cultural historian, and I think that's really good advice. He also references figures like Simone Weil, who was a fascinating character, and he's prompted me to draw from his book a list of figures that I'd like to do more on in future. Simone Weil is one of them. I think she died in 1943 at the age of about 34. Tragic figure, very odd figure, genius figure, so many things going on that gave her an absolutely fascinating and quite controversial life, and she's worth at least a video or two on her own. Then there's all the way through, I'll shut up because I could just list all the theorists that he mentioned. There's a couple, and this is what academics tend to do when they review each other's work. They'll say things like, well, it's not the book I would have written, and it's so, I want to avoid doing that. There's just a couple of theorists, Walter Benjamin and Martin Heidegger, that personally I would have added to the mix, but that is a minor quibble, and it's in the sense that you're never going to get everything in a book. So I don't mean to quibble, but that's something else I'd like to build on some of his ideas using the work of Benjamin and Heidegger in future as well. And aspects of the book that I think are absolutely brilliant. It's so topical, and obviously to some extent we seem to be in the end days of our present culture without trying to be too miserable. And talking about miserable, this is a rare occasion. I don't want to plot spoiler, but at the end of this video, I am surprisingly, for me, quite optimistic. I will hopefully finish on a relatively upbeat note, which regulars to the channel might be shocked by because it doesn't happen very often. But back to the book, it's what's great about it. I like the fact he uses epigraphs. He quotes a lot, so rather than offer his interpretation, it's something I try to do. Insofar as it's practical, I like to quote from the original sources so that if you're putting your own spin on something, the viewer or the reader can make their own mind up. There's always the danger that you take quotes slightly out of context so the reader's not getting the full context from which to make their own opinion. But generally, I think the more you can quote from the original sources, the better. And this is all going towards what prompted me to look at this book in the first place, Kingsnorth's book, is that my long-term project for the channel is to explore the concept of metaphor and the way in which, in the present climate, metaphor and its power and its usefulness has been greatly diminished. And in that sense, metaphor is a small representation of the wider fate of art and literature. But I've read more and more in recent weeks and months about an area of science called cognitive linguistics, and it goes directly to the way in which language structures our reality and the importance of language. And cognitive linguists, there's certain strands of cognitive linguistics that argues the human brain is inextricably linked to the role of metaphor. So that's a story for another day, but in Kingsnorth's book, he's mentioning constantly ways of thinking against the machine or trying to think outside the machine, which is very difficult because, as he jokes himself, I think it'll come up in a later quote, if you lament in a vaguely Luddite way about technology and what it's doing to the world, nowadays you tend to do it in forums like this, on YouTube. So you can, and often if you try and criticize the machine, your critique gets co-opted or absorbed by the machine just to sell more stuff. So it's very, very difficult to actually find alternatives to the machine because we're all trapped within it. But to the extent that it's possible, all the way through the book, I think Kingsnorth alludes to it, the need for more spirituality, the need to still be in touch with past customs and traditions and what he refers to as rootedness. And I would suggest metaphors and literature are, as I'll hope to show in future, are a very powerful resource that actually bear out a lot of what Kingsnorth says. And the other two things that he's encouraged me to do is that he doesn't give them a lot of time. He just drops their names. But Goethe's Faust, I think, is a profoundly important book in Western literature, and I'm determined to do something on that. And the other thing he name dropped was Moby Dick, which I think is just, not that it's underrated because it's obviously a well-known novel, but I would be curious as to how many people these days read it or take it that seriously. But I think it's a very profound novel, and interestingly, a theorist that Kingsnorth refers to a lot in this book is a guy called Lewis Mumford, who wrote a masterpiece called Technics and Civilization, amongst others. And Mumford was, I think he was the second person to do a full biography of Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. And I've just got a book that links the two of them together, their lives and their interests. So that's just something else that Kingsnorth really helped me make some links. And I think that's what a good book should do. You know, I've quoted Kafka in the past. It should be the axe for the frozen sea within us. It should hurt, bite, and sting us, and all those things. But also, it should help us make links and concatenations of ideas. And if nothing else, if you read this book, there's a great, not overwhelming, but there's a good number of notes and further resources and a bibliography that I think if you read this book properly and followed some of the links, you would have a very good overview of some of the key philosophical issues surrounding technology. And like I said, having been that being my professional field back in the day, I think I'm highly impressed by the way he's collated so much disparate information and kept it to a common theme. He makes it look easy when I can assure you it's anything but. So all in all, I've got no links to the guy, never met him, never spoken with him. I've watched a couple of he's got a YouTube channel and a couple of his videos, which I'd suggest you have a look at. But all in all, I just think it's a great book, and he's on the right side. So to get stuck in, all the quotes from now on are from this book, unless I state otherwise. So you are living in a metastasizing which is closing in around you. Most of the things you like are fading away. The empty beaches and wild hilltops. The chance of getting lost in the rain forever or discovering something that was never on any map. This world, you can see, is on the way out if it's not already long gone. The one that is manifesting to replace it is a left brain paradise, all straight lines and concrete car parks, where the corn exchange used to be. So immediately from that, you can make links with Ian McGilchrist's work, the idea of left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and we're living in a world that's borderline autistic because borderline autistic in the sense of the general atmosphere in which we inhabit is over-dominated and over-determined by left hemisphere conceptualization of the world. And McGilchrist's basic argument, if you're not familiar with it, is that the human brain is bicameral. It's in two symmetrical parts, and it's designed for both spheres to work together. And in our society, a lot of our social practices and our technological environment is predisposed to the left-hand side of the brain, which is more calculating and rational versus pattern recognition and the use of metaphorical language and intuition, which is the right hemisphere. These are generalizations, but that's McGilchrist's basic argument. And so that's when he says the left brain paradise, I think he's been slightly sarcastic. And it just made me think, this disappearing of the wild hilltops, the beaches and the wild hilltops, and what he's talking about, it's a paean in the first paragraph there, to I think what most people could recognise, the disappearing natural world as just one little example of how the machine has taken over. And I've mentioned it very early on in this channel in a video where I was in the outer depths of Finland, in the very far north, in the Sami country. I was with some colleagues on a academic conference, and at the time I think he was president of the Sami people, and he showed us around we went travelling around the north just for the day. We were already at an event that I think is the Rovaniemi, I think it's called. It's the most northern university in the world, and we went further north that day, and it was all very interesting, but the Finnish landscape can be a bit dull at times. And on our way back, it was fascinating. We came across, I happened to see it in the tree line and the undergrowth. It was right on the edge of it wasn't a motorway, but it was a large A road in the countryside, and there was this moose, and the guy managed to stop the car and get quite close to it. And obviously, like most people, I've seen animals in the zoo and so on, but it was a very odd experience because this animal just had this bigger eyes than I ever expected. And I'll go into it. I did a video on the look and Renoir and Sartre, but I've always had a weird thing about eyes, and it's not just me. There's a whole, culture about the evil eye. There's lots of superstitions. The eye is a very odd thing. It expresses incredible amounts of emotion and implies an awful lot. And all it is this, globular jelly-like thing. But the eye of the moose just looking back at you, it almost, it was like looking like a couple of thousand years into the past. It was just weird. It was just this ancient sense that you got just from looking in an animal's eye. So that was one aspect, and the other aspect was just really poignantly sad. This huge, beautiful creature on the edge of not a motorway, but on the edge of this road that was like a wound in the Finnish countryside. So anyway, that was just one thing that struck me. Examples of thinking about how the machine dominates the world. So that's from the natural world, and then to put it in terms of culture, I've spoken briefly in a previous video about having spent about a month in Venice, and the way in which Venice as an experience, as an architectural experience, as a cultural experience, is just completely ruined by over tourism. And I was there before, I think, the super cruisers, the massive cruise ships began to dock, and then I think more recently they've stopped them dropping people off in Venice. But still, even at the time, it was massively overcrowded. And I remember, I've never owned a mobile phone. I hate the things. But I had an Italian girlfriend at the time who I was staying with in Venice. And it was the very early days when you began to get notices that was specific to the location you were. So you'd walk past a building and her phone would light up with information about that local landmark. So it goes to this thing about not just even the wild hilltops, but you couldn't explore a beautiful place like Venice without this digital intrusion being told or suggested what you should go and see, or having all the information provided straight away at your fingertips rather than finding out for yourself. And then just one other example. I'm just going to give examples of the way in which the machine manifests itself in ways that I think are true to what Kingsnorth is saying, but from a slightly different, my own subjective perspective. So another example would be Prague Castle. I went there once with another girlfriend. This is like Paul's Tales of Casanova experiences. But that was another I was going to say highly depressing experience, not because of the girlfriend, but because of what Prague, the castle, you walked up the hill, and there were people dressed in Mozart of its time costumes to try and get you to go to a Mozart concert. So it was heavy sell, and it was kitsch. And then we went to go into the Prague, I don't know whether it qualifies as a cathedral, but there's a church. And I was about to go in, and I got shoulder barged by this massive German woman going into a church. And I couldn't help myself. I basically said, "What do you think you're doing?" Which then wasn't very good, because you're about to enter a church and you've just kicked off and argued with someone. But it was just, she had this manic, the way some tourists, they have to get to the front of the queue type mania in her eyes. And without using ethnic stereotypes, Germans aren't always the best at queuing, I found. But she was like a prop forward rugby player willing to take anyone out the game who was going to get in front of her. So there was a bit of standoff and handbags at 10 paces. But it just struck me that it's an example I'm going to talk about, or Kingsnorth refers to spirituality in churches. Or, sorry, he refers to spirituality, and I'm going to make reference to a specific cathedral later on at the very end of this video. But you can't even go into a church sometimes in certain parts of the world without the very original purpose of that building almost having been completely forgotten. It's just on the tourist route, another thing to be ticked off. So I'm suggesting that's another example of the machine that Kingsnorth's describing here. There is no arguing with it. Well, I had an argument with that German woman. You can feel the great craters that it makes in the world. You can feel what is being tarmacked and neatened and rationalised into oblivion, and the depth of what is leaving. But you cannot explain or justify it in the terms which are now the terms we live by. You just know that something is wrong. So that's what I was trying to give with those clumsy examples. They're not scientific in any shape or form. They're very subjective experiences. But I think they do point to and allude to what Kingsnorth's describing here. You just know that something is wrong. This earth is a broken version of the garden, our original integration with Creator and creation. So he's talking about the Garden of Eden, obviously. On earth, we must toil to break the soil, to plant seeds, to fight off predators. We will sicken and die. Everything is eating everything else. There is war and dominion and misery. There is beauty and love and friendship too. But all of it ends in death. You can see why I like Kingsnorth, can't you? These are the consequences of our pursuit of knowledge and power, but we keep pursuing them because we know no other means to escape from our exile. We keep building towers and cities and forgetting where we came from. Outside the garden, we are homeless and can never be still. We forget the Creator and worship ourselves. All of this happens inside of us every day. And I'm quoted this because I think it points to implicitly Kingsnorth is using the book of Genesis as a way of describing the cultural effect or the psychological effect of technology. He's going back to the metaphor of the book of Genesis and the Adam and Eve story. And that is, I think, one of the strengths of, I'm going to talk about it on the channel, this idea of an agnostic guide to the Bible, the new playlist I'm doing, because Kingsnorth happens to be, I think he's experimented in terms of spirituality. I think at one point in the book he even describes how he practiced Wicca, but now I think he's a member of the Orthodox Christian Church. So he has pursued spirituality, and he's obviously been heavily influenced by Christianity. But the point of the agnostic guide to the Bible I'm beginning to produce is that it's just incredibly useful as a cultural resource to have ancient books that identify essential, eternal human questions that are still highly relevant. So the fact that Kingsnorth can refer to the book of Genesis and it still provides really perspicacious insights into what technology, the machine, is all about and what the human condition is all about. So this idea that the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, but the tree of knowledge we were told not to eat the apple from, but we did, then you get kicked out the Garden of Eden and life is all about struggle. And it matters not a jot whether you believe in God or you believe whether the Bible is directly inspired by God. Just as a humanist tract, it's an amazing piece of literature full of wisdom and psychological insight. And beyond the literature of it, there's obviously the art. So, you know, regulars to the channel know I need no excuse to reach for a Gustave Doré illustration. But this is leaving the Garden of Eden from one of his illustrations of the Bible. And you can tell by the archangel's sword, you're not coming back, is the message. And then this is called Expulsion from the Garden of Eden by a guy, an American artist called Thomas Cole. And I think this painting was done between 1827 and 1828. And Thomas Cole was the founder of the Hudson River School art movement. Basically, they did a lot of landscapes, and they were highly influenced or largely influenced by Romanticism. And I like the perverse way in this painting that the figures of Adam and Eve are so small. You really have to look for them. And it's just the sheer scale of their expulsion is emphasised by the minuteness of the figures. So you can just see a little bit more detail there. And then I won't dwell too much on this because, like I say, I want to look at biblical writing in future anyway. But as a notion of how to make sense of or how to draw upon stories that have meaning in them, because in at least one chapter of Kingsnorth's books, he talks about the need for roots, a sense of rootedness, and also a sense of meaning. And just a story like the book of Genesis, 2,500 years old or more, lends itself to this long cultural history of other representations and resonances. So this is the Masaccio fresco of the Garden of Eden in the Brancacci Chapel in Italy. So you might be familiar on the left-hand side with Adam and Eve, but this is the context in the chapel of the actual fresco. And there's a close-up. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt and saying I think Adam was a bit cold that day. And there's just the context of the actual chapel itself. So it's just stunning, the amount of absolutely incredible art in such a small little space. And the painting next to Adam and Eve is absolutely fascinating. There's a whole narrative within it, and I need an excuse to look at Renaissance painting in future. I'm going to do a section on that particular painting, which has always intrigued me. And this is a detail. 1427, they estimate. I just find the figure of Eve's face, there's an anguish. It's like Jean Fautrier figures, faces or semi-faces, because he doesn't do proper faces. Elements of Edvard Munch, even perhaps Francis Bacon. You just think so far ahead of its time. Culture, I think, now is above all the spiritual creation. When the cult departs from the heart of the culture, the thing starts to fall apart. The centre cannot hold. And he doesn't reference this, but it strikes me as obviously referencing Yeats's poem. So this is The Second Coming, which my good friend Richard Grannon did a reading of on the channel, if you look back in the poetry reading section. But turning and turning in the widening Gaia, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So this is the first stanza of the poem. The last two lines of that stanza, I just think, are an amazing summary of the current cultural climate. The passionate intensity of people seems largely to be inversely proportional to their actual goodness of character. In all the time sorry, that should say in all the time, I have spent with people who live in genuinely rooted cultures, rooted in time, place, and spirit. I have been struck by one fact. People don't tend to talk much about their identity unless it is under threat. The louder you talk about it, the more you have lost. Once an entire country is talking about nothing else, that's a pretty good sign that the machine has sprayed the roots of its people with Roundup and ploughed the remains into the field. It reminds me of that reference at the end. That's a modern language, but I think when Rome conquered Carthage, they sowed the ground with salt so they could never produce any crops anymore. They didn't mess around, the Romans, did they? And this is in a chapter where he mentions, I cited her earlier, Simone Weil, and she did a short book called The Need for Roots. And it's well worth a look at if you're interested. It's a long, complicated story, but basically she escaped France during the Second World War because she came from a completely assimilated Jewish family, and she herself was, it's complicated, she was a devout Catholic in one sense, but she never actually got baptized for quite complex theological reasons of her own. And she's just an unbelievably complicated character because she left with her parents to get to America to get them to safety, then tried to come back to France and ended up, to cut a long story short, in London writing for the Free French, Charles de Gaulle's group. And one of her jobs was she was desperate to get flown in behind enemy lines and help the war effort because she wanted basically to be a martyr. She really did have this messiah complex, and she'd already fought on the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War. But it's quite funny in the sense that she had a tragic life. She died so young of what they would probably diagnose today as anorexia. But it was more complicated than that because she had this generalized desire to repress herself that was caught up in so many other things, not just food. But she, in the fighting for the Spanish Republicans, when I first read about it, I thought she'd got injured fighting, but she was infamously clumsy. And I think she stood on a huge vat of cooking oil or something and burnt herself. So she was invalided out. And there were stories of her. She was a teacher in a high school, and her students used to have to help her turn her jumper the right way round and things. She was just absolutely hapless and hopeless, as most geniuses are. So he goes on to say, we turned away from a spiritual, rooted understanding of the world in order to look at ourselves, reflected in the little black mirror in our hands. Some people are quite happy with this and have no time for romantic Luddites like me when we lament it. Even we romantic Luddites are doing much of our lamenting on the internet. And this is what I was saying earlier about the inescapability of the machine. In order for people like me to drone on about how evil it is, here I am on YouTube, I am aware of the irony. And at this point, I just wanted to do a little visual interlude because the machine, the way Kingsnorth describes it, and I agree with him, is quite psychological. So this is what I meant earlier on when I said I think I would have added to his analysis, and I will do in future, Martin Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology essay, and in compare and contrast it with Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Benjamin's essay was written in 1935, and Heidegger's was it 53 or 54? But they're both, I would argue, the two seminal essays about the way in which technology affects quite subtly the way we go about our lives and is quite an invasive force. And what I want to show you now is not psychological, it's physical. But I'm asking you to think about that as a metaphor. If you can be led by technology in a physical way, Imagine how much more subtle and powerful it is if you're psychologically affected. So this is called a Berlin key. And as the name implies, it was used in Berlin back in the day when there were large apartment blocks, when people lived, on top of each other. And the idea was it's designed so that in these large apartment tenements, you didn't want anyone just leaving the front door open, for various security reasons and so on. So what this key actually, it forces you, when you put it through the door, you have to push it through. You can see it's double-sided. And while you've opened the door, while the door's still open, you push it through, and then you go through to the other side, and you have to close the door and pull the key out. And in the act of pulling the key out, you can only pull it out by also locking the door behind you. So it's an incredibly clever, simple, but genius way of making people. It's structuring their behavior through the design of the very object itself. So I don't know if you can make this out, but this is, you can see the keyhole. It sounded like Lloyd Grossman then, through the keyhole. But the keyhole is designed to turn the key upwards and then be able to push it through. So it looks like a little bit of a right angle. It's not the normal, just vertical keyhole. I hope I've explained that so it makes sense. But the basic point from that image you can see is to get that key, you have to push it through. You can't just pull it out. So you push it through, but you have to be on the other side of the door to take it back. And by that time, you've closed the door. I'm sorry if it underwhelms you as an example, but I just think it's such a beautifully simple idea of forcing you to do something. And that's at the most physical, primitive level. And I'd argue things like the almighty algorithm that dominates YouTube users and producers, I might add, is so much more psychologically invasive and determining than this little key. So again, he says, when a plant is uprooted, it withers and dies. When the same happens to a person or a people or a planet full of both, the result is the same. Our crisis comes, I think, from our being unable to admit what on some level we know to be true, that we in the West are living inside an obsolete story. Our culture is not in danger of dying, it is already dead, and we're in denial. This now is the reality we have to wrestle with and transcend. So I promise you I'm going to get optimistic shortly, but this is Kingsnorth basically saying we need to boil our heads in vinegar and realise, the so-called culture wars. I think I've referred to it in the past as two bald men fighting over a comb. And that phrase might even be used in Kingsnorth's book. I can't remember. But he seems to, I'm in total agreement with this idea that it's not nostalgic to be lamenting the culture we used to have, but you do have to come to terms with the fact it is well and truly over. And that interestingly begs the question, how do you transcend it? And forgive me, I'm going to go on a slight, I hope it's not too much of a tangent because I see it as being implicitly linked to this. But when I read this first bit, when a plant is uprooted, it withers and dies. When the same thing happens to a person or a people or a planet full of both, the result is the same. I don't make a habit of watching Piers Morgan because I really don't like him for various reasons, maybe get into at some other point. But he did an interview recently with Chris Williamson, who's a hugely successful influencer. And I can't remember the name of the doctor, but he's basically a doctor to the stars. And I think Dana White in America was seriously ill, and this doctor was credited with helping detox him, basically. So you had a three-way conversation between Piers Morgan, being his usual self, Chris Williamson, and the Doctor. And then I think at one point, Michaela Peterson, Jordan Peterson's daughter, was interviewed as part of the discussion because Jordan Peterson has been very ill. And I know for a fact Jordan Peterson, from previous discussions he's had, has long had an immunological problem. There's something wrong with his immune system, and his daughter too, and they're on some carnivore diet, and they've spoken about it at length. But just recently, Jordan Peterson's had a bit of a collapse in his health. Chris Williamson, about the time of making this video, about a week ago, did a vlog all about his serious illness. And both of them and the Doctor were talking in general terms about people's immune systems being compromised and the potential reasons for this. And if you know anything about Chris Williamson, he's excessively fit, if that's a thing. Obviously, I'm not. But so I might use the accusation he's excessively fit, but he's just ridiculously fit, spends a long time in the gym. I've seen a lot of his podcasts and interviews all about looking after yourself, sleeping properly, biohacking. And then he got this compromised immune system, and the vlog is all about him battling this compromised immune system. And when I saw what he was talking about and what Jordan Peterson's gone through, I might be completely wrong because, you know, you don't know the ins and outs of their personal medical histories. But the Doctor was fascinating because I didn't think I'd agree with him. I thought he was on the side of the detoxing and the slightly woo-woo medicine, holistic side of things. And he was, but also he made some really interesting points that I think are relevant to this concept of the machine. So he suggested at one point that in the good old days, people would go off to the seaside for 6 weeks. Or there's Thomas Mann's book when people were trying to recover from TB, they'd be sent to, in the Magic Mountain, a sanatorium in Switzerland where the air was pure. So he said people would go to the seaside to recover and get to see air. And at this point, Piers Morgan mentioned he lives in, I think it was Kensington, he lives in some part of London where the air pollution is horrendous. And both he and Chris Williamson are workaholics. They're incredibly, overachievers. And the very fact that Chris Williamson made a vlog about his medical condition and didn't do what the Doctor was suggesting, that, maybe just take 6 weeks off, stop making videos and properly recover. And there seemed to be this cognitive dissonance whereby when they were discussing Jordan Peterson's ill health and when they were discussing Chris Williamson's, just to repeat, I may be completely wrong because I may not be getting the whole picture, but it does strike me as innately ironic that they're working really hard and with pseudo efficiency at curing themselves of this generalized illness that's all about their immune system. And the Doctor, again, to back my argument up with the Doctor's own opinion, the Doctor was saying the human immune system is an amazing thing, but you have to let it do its work. And when it becomes compromised through sheer stress or the various toxins in the world around us, things start going downhill badly. And this is all to say that the Doctor kept referring to the things that maybe Jordan Peterson and Chris Williamson should be doing, but can't seem to do because they're so enmeshed in the machine. So God forbid that Jordan Peterson and Chris Williamson don't produce a video every 2 days, or everything they do is turned into a vlog. And it just strikes me that living under that type of pressure, the other thing, on a purely practical basis, they must be travelling constantly. Recycled air of aircraft travel just sat there, not moving about much. The hotels they have to stay in, just on and on and on. It strikes me that that type of lifestyle, right in the belly of the beast of the machine, can't be good for you. But they didn't. The Doctor seemed to be quite reflective And he seemed to be implying quite a lot of stuff, but I don't think he was ever going to turn around and say to Jordan Peterson or Chris Williamson, you really need to stop working for 2 months. That never seemed to be discussed as part of the program. And I'll just finish on that because I could go on about it forever. But it's the idea that the machine inveigles its way into how you think you need to live your life. And even very reflective people who make their living from reflecting upon things and influencing other people can't seem to step out of it for long enough to get a perspective on what the machine is doing to them as well. And so that's just prosaic medical, well, not prosaic because it's quite serious what they're both suffering from. But on a broader scale, so take this from individual people to take it to the notion of history, how we understand the machine through a historical lens. So there's a essay Walter Benjamin wrote, section 9, on the concept of history. And I'll read you the section and I'll show you the painting he's referring to. A Klee painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing in from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such a violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. So I just think that's it's my little addition. Well, it's Benjamin's, but I'm adding it to Kingsnorth's analysis of the machine to provide yet another perspective on this concept of the machine and how it's progressed through history. And that's the painting he was referring to. From 1920. If the machine is a monster that grows in deserts, then 2 revolutions are instrumental in creating the desert that is modernity. Industrialism's physical clearances, he's talking about the land enclosures in Britain that led to the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. The enclosures of land and the destruction of artisanship and the peasantry were mirrored by the French tsunami, the French Revolution, in which monarchy, aristocracy, church and customs of all kinds were to be swept away and replaced by a new world designed along rational lines to promote virtue through the rigorous application of that most vital Enlightenment value, reason. So there's 2 things I'd say here. One is, in reverse order, the French Revolution was fascinating for the way in which Robespierre belatedly realised you destroy all these traditional forms of meaning, and they basically had to recreate Catholicism but call it the supreme being of reason and the Church of Reason. And like in a lot of these totalitarian dictatorial revolutions, Pol Pot, Mao, all these people, Lenin, they have to change everything. You start from year zero, literally in Pol Pot's case. And he refers to it throughout. I think there's a quote coming up. But Kingsnorth refers to, there's a wonderful book that I was already familiar with, and this is an example of a lot of the books that Kingsnorth quotes are just brilliant choices. So John Ralston Saul, sure if he's Canadian. He's North American, I think he might be Canadian. But he wrote a brilliant book called Voltaire's Bastards, which is just, it's a wonderful book describing how post-Voltaire, through people like Rousseau, Voltaire, and the French Enlightenment, there was a complete over-reliance upon pure rationality and an unrealistic belief in the power of reason. So he's describing, this is Kingsnorth describing what Saul says in Voltaire's Bastards. So both meaning the revolutions, both were in the final analysis set in motion by people he calls optimistic rationalists, who imagine whole populations sliced free of their limiting past and present, then flipped over to fry in a new, clean future with all the inanimate passivity of a Big Mac. The inevitable result of such utopianism was always to unleash a level of violence which in this clean new world, liberated from experience and common sense, would be virtually unrestrainable. So there's various things to say about that, but again, it goes back to things like Ian McGilchrist and the cognitive linguistics, the idea that you can separate the naive belief, and I say naive, but some of the most powerful people in history have subjected whole populations to this belief in optimistic rationalism. This misguided idea that things can be worked on a plan. You know, the ridiculous Soviet 5-year plans. And in Western democracies today, if I had, for example, when I worked in the university system, every time there was a new university manager, there'd be a complete reorganisation of faculties endlessly. The NHS has, you know, if I had £1 for every revamp or reorganisation the NHS has had over the last 30 years, you'd be a millionaire. And there's various writers you could link to this, but there's a wonderful English historian stroke philosopher, Michael Oakeshott, and he distinguishes between two different types of human organisation. One is a civil association, so that's a society based upon negative liberty. In other words, you have certain rights that are protected, but what the society then chooses to do is up to its individual members and the way in which they associate with each other. So the society doesn't have a particular project, a specific project. So that would be what he calls a civil association. And he contrasts that with what he calls an enterprise culture. And that doesn't mean it's business orientated. He uses it in a different way. But an enterprise culture, he gives the example as far back as the Tower of Babel. God destroyed the Tower of Babel because the people were trying to be too dogmatically project-led, whereas God wanted them to go forth and multiply, spread across the corners of the earth. So it's an interesting aspect of the book of Genesis whereby God, for at least a certain period of time, seems anti-city. That's where sin seems to dwell. But it's also where this excessive rationalism, and Kingsnorth does whole sections of the book talking via Lewis Mumford, his analysis of the role of modern cities. Because Kingsnorth himself, he mentions he lives in the west of Ireland. He's tried to go as much off-grid as he can. But it's just interesting, this notion of optimistic rationality, the idea that you can apply reason. And John Ralston Saul's book in Voltaire's Bastards, the emphasis he continually places on, it's like reading, I'm trying to think of a literary example, but Catch-22, brilliant book by Joseph Heller. That is a perfect example in literary form of how these optimistic rationalists, the bureaucrats in the US Army, in the case of Catch-22. Their attempt to be rational creates irrationality of the highest order. So I'm trying to remember the essential Catch-22 that it's entered the English language from that novel. But the idea is that he was a Yossarian, the protagonist, as a fighter pilot, a bomber, and in order to be excused endless dangerous raids, you have to say you're mentally ill or you're too stressed to fly. But if you complain that you're too stressed to fly because it's dangerous, you can't be mentally ill because you have the sense to realise that it's dangerous and that you're stressed. And that's a perfectly rational response. So you're trapped in this bureaucratic loop whereby you can only be freed from bombing duties if you put yourself forward and complain. But the minute you put yourself forward and complain, your application will automatically be rejected because you're doing a very rational thing. I think I might have explained that badly. It's years since I've read it. But that's basically what it's about. The Catch-22 is you cannot win. And then the other thing I'd say about this is the violence that gets unleashed. Because the other things he's talking about, a world liberated from experience and common sense. Common sense and experience and tradition and customs and culture, they act as a brake. They act as restraint. And when those things are removed, the violence is unleashed. And again, on a much lower level, but in the current culture wars, there seems to be certain sectors of society spend all their time screaming and shouting while simultaneously claiming they're incredibly tolerant. But there seems to be no restraint. The brakes have been taken off. And there's just this sheer anger because there seems to be some inability to understand that through custom and tradition, other people may not share their dogmatic ideological values. But just to finish off now, one of the things that's interesting also is that these type of ideologies and the excessive rationality that is described in the book Voltaire's Bastards, they have faces. So the French Revolution had Robespierre and Danton, various people. Mao was obviously the charismatic leader of the Chinese Revolution. Lenin, and so on and so on. Arguably, we were now in this excessive rationalized world that Kingsnorth calls the machine. But in some ways it's more insidious because there aren't Maoists waving little red books. Or maybe that's a bad example because effectively with identity politics and so on, there is a contemporary equivalent of that. But generally, the power that exists in our society now that's exercised or diffused through the machine. There aren't often many identifiable leaders who you can individually blame. There are the oligarchs, the Bezos, the Musks of this world, but the actual power they have is disseminated through networks throughout the whole of society, and they're just the figurehead. So there are elements, they are a modern version, but I suppose they'd hide behind the fact that they would claim to be non-ideological. They're just technologists. They're just trying to improve the lot of mankind. So Bezos with his space program, Musk with his space program, they're trying to do things they would argue for the common weal. It's not ideological, but I still think it fits Oakeshot's notion of an enterprise society. And the point I'm clumsily trying to make is with someone like Mao or Lenin, or if you lived during the Cold War in Eastern Europe, you knew what you were opposing. Psychologically, you knew that you resented or secretly opposed the overt power structures of society. But in today's world where the power is diffused so much more, I was going to say organically, but it's not. It's the machine. That's what Kingsnorth's complaining about. It's not organic. It's machine-like. It's digital now. It's beyond the machine. It's this cyberspatial control that's much more difficult to identify. So this is an area of Silicon Valley. This is San Jose. So this is as much as you could say that the technology has a focal point, although obviously nowadays Silicon Valley may have been one of the places where it started, but it's not the sole place. To repeat, this technology is diffused around the world. This is San Jose at night. And I show you this to end on an optimistic note, because this reminded me of, and I've put a link to the video in which I look at this, which is the Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. And it was just the colouring of the two things. And also, I'll show you in a second, there are brutalist elements in Silicon Valley. The architecture is not beautiful. And when I did a video, like I say, it's in the description of this video, there's a link. But I did a video looking at the, inverted commas, the 3 cathedrals in Liverpool. This cathedral, the Protestant cathedral, the Anglican cathedral, and what I call the cathedral, the Philharmonic pub. And what interested me was, I was slightly taken by surprise that so many people find this. It is part of what's known as Brutalist architecture. And it was built in 1967. And maybe I'm too close to this, because whenever I go back to Liverpool, I always make a point of visiting this. And I was brought up Catholic. But I see this as beautiful. And one of the reasons, and before you shout at me, because so many people just say it's known locally as Paddy's Wigwam, and I'll shortly show you pictures from the inside. But one of the interesting elements is, this may look ugly the way you're looking at it now. It may not. You may think it's quite stunning. But lots of people do not like it, think it's ugly. But I've yet to meet someone who's actually experienced it at first hand and gone inside and not been impressed. And one of the reasons for that is it relates to the essay I mentioned earlier, Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in which he talks about the concept of aura, a unique point in space and time. And to experience this building in reality, personally, it has an aura. It has a spiritual element, if you're religious or not, I'd suggest. Because I'm agnostic, I'm no longer a believer. And yet, I cannot go to this place without finding it a really quite a profound spiritual experience. Now, by contrast to that, this is Apple Park in Cupertino, California. And I believe that's the world's biggest solar panel system on the ring on top. And the irony is, I think Kingsnorth points out that these green initiatives, for example, to have solar panels, are basically to make up for the incredible amount of energy that these industries, the so-called clean industries of IT and AI, actually require. Never mind, the poisonous metals that little African kids have to mine so that people can endlessly play on their stupid mobile phones. But I wanted to contrast that, the circularity, with this is a shot of the inside, the spire of the Metropolitan Cathedral. And what I'm trying to point out is that the same use of the same shape, sorry, not the same use, the same shape, the same brutalist materials. This is made of concrete. And yet they do something with this cathedral that is truly, like I say, when you experience it in person, the sheer volume of air, the peacefulness, that sound just gets absorbed in this huge area of space above your head. And that's a view from the inside the spire looking down at the altar. It's like a scene from Cape Canaveral, but it's, again, sorry to repeat myself, but you have to go and witness it to actually realise how rooted it is. And I wanted to pick up on this Kingsnorth idea of rootedness and meaning. I think what I'm suggesting here is that you can have the same materials, the brutalist architecture, the same superficially ugly materials such as cement, but if you have a sense of rootedness, it's rooted in Christian theology, it's an integral part of the city of Liverpool, and it's redolent with meaning, then I'd suggest the experience is exponentially more significant than if you went to visit the Apple headquarters. And just to back up that, to make a link with Kingsnorth's own argument, in his 1994 book Descartes' Error, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio uses the fruits of a lifetime's work to demolish the notion that anything like an abstracted reason existed. Reason, it turned out, was not a superior alternative to intuition, emotion, or instinct, but a manifestation of it. There could be no mind without the body, no unprejudiced concepts or unpolluted models of reality. There could, in short, be no reason without the messy world it was embedded in. And again, I think we're coming back now to, I've mentioned in previous videos, the work of Terence Deacon, the symbolic species, this idea of cognitive linguistics, the inescapable link of language, which is the use of abstractions, but it's an innate, according to Deacon and others, it's an innate part of the structure of the human brain. And according to a new, relatively new field of cognitive linguistics that goes against people like Chomsky, they argue that the human brain evolved so rapidly compared to the apes, who've remained static. The rapid evolution of the human brain, according to various scientists, they would argue, is because the human brain and language co-evolved, that they're inextricably linked, which I think is a nice way of thinking about this phrase. There could be, in short, no reason without the messy world it was embedded in. There's nothing much more messy than the human brain in terms of its physical jelly-like crenulated substance. That is messy, gooey, and yet that is the vehicle from which we get reason. And it's interesting, Ian McGilchrist, his 2-volume epic, The Matter with Things, is equally, the concentration is about this paradoxical relationship between the abstract and the physical and how they can't be separated. And arguably this is what the left hemisphere, right hemisphere brain argument is all about. The bicameral cooperation of the right hand and the left hand side of the brain are what arguably enable us to make sense of this coexistence of the abstract and the physical. The left-hand side of the brain is about calculation. It's about ordered mathematical patterns. That helps us measure reality, whereas in a scientific type of way, whereas the right-hand side of the brain is much more metaphorical, seeing subtle, intuitive patterns. And that arguably helps us make sense of the messiness of the real world. So together, that is a well-adjusted human being. But in a world in which the left-hand side, the left hemisphere of the brain has been privileged and technology overindulges it, that's what creates social, emotionally dysregulated people. But if reason as a thing in and of itself is non-existent, then any culture built on its back must in the end fail. If this is true, then another conclusion also suggests itself, that older ways of seeing and speaking, mythology, folk cultures, and the mystical underpinnings of religious faith might have been onto something after all. So I'll leave you on a rare optimistic note that in the midst of the machine, and in this particular case I'll finish with 2 images of brutalist architecture within which the mystical underpinnings of religious faith still speak against the machine. So I hope you enjoy that. Till the next time, all the best. I'll just finish now with 2 images. And sorry to butt in again, but please, I just ask you to focus on the circularity as opposed to the apple, and then the apple headquarters and the use of the circle there. And in this very final image, I just think this is an example of how the abstract and the physical, the messiness of the world and the abstract are combined beautifully. You'll notice the lighting system above the altar is replicating the crown of thorns.